sold him on the idea he could write a paper on it and turn it into a leadership program. Well, it turned into be a real leadership program. It sparked this interest for him in outdoors. He went on to become a Colorado Outward Bound instructor, course director, and later the executive director of the school, as well as a pretty prominent mountaineer. He's climbed a lot of the major peaks around the world. And he was in Congress when 9/11 happened, when we ended up going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he talked a lot about what it was like to be in that position and having to make really hard, critical decisions. And he was one of the few people that was opposed to us going into Iraq. So I won't go into politics at all in the conversation, but just say that for him, this standing for what you believe in, this truth, this is the teachings of Kurt Hahn originally on to say you stand in your truth if you're going to follow Outward Bound's methodology. And so he said to be able to do that, knowing that it could end my career, but also knowing that I needed to do what I believed was right. He also talked a lot about finding common ground with the opposing party through, he got people out in the wilderness a lot. So he said I would take other congressmen hiking with me up in Colorado, and we would get up on a mountain together, and then it didn't matter what party we're in, we could develop a real relationship together. So just really pretty incredible stories. So those lessons to me were things that helped guide me as I moved into my own leadership development, and it also it reminded me of how critically important it is. It can feel right now to me, it can feel like we're really divided as a country. It can feel around the world like there are a lot of problems right now. This isn't the only country in the world where there's a lot of rising populism and nationalism, and there's a lot of tension going on. We also are facing unprecedented environmental challenges, and those are hard things. We've unleashed a lot of change. So if we go back to that beginning of story I talked about, when we were switching from an agrarian to a industrialized society, there was a lot of unintended consequences of those changes. And right now, the speed of change is so fast that it can be very difficult to keep up with how that is affecting how we live, how we function, and it can cause a lot of disequilibrium. I grew up in the Midwest, and I would tell you, there are a lot of people in the Midwest, in northeastern Ohio, when the steel industry collapsed in the 70s, it never really bounced back. So people there feel left behind. The changes, the modernization, the multiculturalism, it can feel threatening to people who feel left behind. And I think Outward Bound provides a leadership model which allows us to pull ourselves together, not to splinter apart. And so I think it's really important right now that we take these lessons to heart and we recognize that there's some simple truths that Outward Bound talks about. So one is that we all need each other. We cannot achieve anything if we're not together. When you go on an expedition with Outward Bound, you leave the safety of the known. You're in a small group. Most people have never been in a wilderness area in their lives, and they certainly have never camped in that kind of intensity, and you head off on this trip, and you don't really know what's going to happen. And people learn to depend on each other. And at the same time, most people who do an Outward Bound course don't have wilderness skills. Most people who take courses are not backcountry people, and that's by design. Outward Bound isn't there to teach people how to become great rock climbers or great campers. But it is there to teach people how to form community, how to support each other when it's hard. And inevitably on an Outward Bound course, everybody faces some kind of adversity. You hit a spot where you're not sure if you can do it or not. And sometimes that's physical. For a lot of people, rock climbing, heights gets them, ropes courses, all these things are designed to put people out of their comfort zone. They're intentional by Outward Bound to get people out of their comfort zone, because in that moment is when you can learn about yourself. But if you don't have a supportive community, you won't be able to take that learning and do something with it. So the other part of Outward Bound is to always create that supportive community. And for some people, that's actually the hardest part of the experience. It's not the physical, it's living intimately with a small group for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, as long as a semester. And yet, what you learn is how to have a healthy conflict and work through it, how to support people when they're struggling and at their most vulnerable, and how to not yield when you get into that hard spot, to recognize that you can do more than you thought you could do. One of the people that I interviewed is a woman named Rue Mapp. Rue was an African-American woman who took a mountaineering course, and she tells a great story of how she camped growing up. So when you go on an Outward course, you get a clothing list and it tells you what to bring. So she one of the things that was on there was a headlamp, and she said, well, I don't need a headlamp, I have a flashlight. So she brought a flashlight, and by the third day of the course, they were doing a major climbing ascent to get up to climb a mountain. The next morning they had to get up to a saddle. So she's climbing on a multi-pitch climb. So multi-pitch means more than one rope, and it's getting dark. So that's why you need a headlamp. And Outward Bound lets people kind of experience the consequences of their choices. So they could have bailed her out by giving her a headlamp, but they didn't. So she had to climb first because they wanted to get her up, and it was getting dark. She was up by her instructor, and she was losing light, and she said she just completely lost it on the rock face. She's crying, falling apart emotionally, and so she said the instructor leaned into her and said, Rue, just trust your feet. You don't have to be able to see here, just trust your feet. And she trusted her feet. She finished the climb, and that experience has become the sea change of her life. Later on, as she was deciding whether to go into graduate school or not, she was talking with a counselor, and that story popped out, and the counselor looked at her and said, well, if you metaphorically trust your feet, what would you do? And she said, well, I'd want to get other African Americans out into the wilderness because there aren't enough African Americans to go into the wilderness. And that began an organization called Outdoor Afro, which now is across the United States and has taken out nearly 50,000 African Americans into the wilderness, and has trained leaders that also became the first African American team that climbed Mount Kilimanjaro 2 years ago. And she served on presidential commission, and she just won a Heinz Award for the work that she's doing. And all of that came from that moment of facing that adversity on the rock and learning something from it. And that's the methodology of Outward Bound. It's really putting people in an experience, giving them the opportunity to face adversity in a supportive environment, and the support to learn what they need to learn for themselves. So I'm going to stop talking, just curious if people have questions or thoughts. Does it spark anything as we're talking? Just love to hear what you think. Lots of people back over there. You could scoot over closer too. Any questions?